In the Third Reich, science was integrated into the system of power as a functional tool. Every project had to meet a concrete need of the regime. If it did not serve the military, industry, or social control, it was cancelled. Universities were reorganized to align with the objectives of the state. Researchers worked under surveillance, and fields of study that did not offer immediate benefits were shut down. Laboratories, companies, and technicians came under military command. Weapons, untested vaccines, combat vehicles, and surveillance systems were developed. Production was maintained with forced labor taken from the camps. Many projects used prisoners as test subjects. Knowledge was applied directly to tasks of repression, extermination, and exploitation. Research ceased to be free. It was absorbed by a system that allowed only what could be used to advance, control, or eliminate. How far did science really go when it stopped responding to truth and began to serve obedience? Science under orders: how Hitler turned it into a weapon of the regime. From early on, Hitler saw science as useful only if it served his plans, and worthless if it had no immediate practical use. He was not interested in theoretical ideas, much less in scientists who defended complex thoughts without military or industrial applications. Instead, he preferred technological advancements that could give him power, an advantage in combat, or control over society. Even though he never understood the fundamentals of physics or chemistry, Hitler was clear that technology could strengthen his regime. He supported the development of weapons, infrastructure projects, and new surveillance methods. But he rejected what he called intellectualism, because he believed it took science away from its real function, serving the state. In many speeches, Hitler said he did not believe in science by itself. He only accepted it if it helped to strengthen the body, improve the race, or build useful tools. He did not trust laboratories where theories were discussed, but factories where concrete things were produced. For him, the value of a scientist depended on his usefulness to the party. During the rise of the regime, Hitler surrounded himself with technical advisors. Some were engineers, others doctors or logistics experts. He did not ask them for scientific opinions, but for results. He wanted quick solutions, functional designs, projects that served his plans for territorial expansion or social cleansing. One of the most marked aspects was his obsession with racial purity applied to medicine. He ordered doctors and scientists to work on methods to eliminate what he called undesirable life, people with mental illnesses, disabilities, or hereditary conditions. Medicine became an instrument of biological control. Hitler also imposed ideological criteria within the academic world. Universities were cleansed of Jews, communists, and any figure who did not fit the party profile. Scientific publications were censored. Only theories aligned with the official ideology could circulate, regardless of whether they were true or not. Even in areas like physics, the regime created its own Aryan version, that is, a science without Jewish influence. Great names like Einstein were discarded, not for their mistakes, but for their origin. Mediocre researchers who aligned with the policy were supported, even if their theories were weak or outdated. Meanwhile, real advancements came from military or industrial sectors. Companies like IG Farben and Siemens collaborated directly with the regime, manufacturing everything from chemical products to electrical systems for concentration camps. Science was no longer independent, but a tool of power. Hitler believed that true talent lay in those who could build, not in those who thought. That is why he supported engineers who made bridges, weapons, or trains, and despised mathematicians who spoke of formulas without immediate utility. That mentality shaped the entire scientific policy of the regime. There was no interest in training young scientists. What mattered was having loyal technicians, willing to obey without questioning. Many brilliant researchers escaped the country before it was too late. Others were forced to collaborate or remained silent to survive. Medical research was one of the most intervened areas. Studies on twins, contagious diseases, and the effects of hunger were ordered, using prisoners as test material. Although these acts were brutal, they were justified as science applied to the health of the state. Hitler also promoted secret programs, some related to rockets, others to submarines or new forms of energy. But he did not do it out of admiration for science, but in the hope of finding a weapon that would change the course of the war. If something did not serve that purpose, he discarded it. Throughout his government, Hitler used science as a disguise. He claimed his policies had medical basis, that his decisions were rational, that his extermination campaigns were justified by studies on heredity or degeneration. It was a way to hide crime under technical words. In private, he spoke with contempt about scientists. He said they were weak, that they lived in a world of useless ideas, that they did not know how real life worked. He only valued those who built things or destroyed enemies. That was always his measure of knowledge. The role of Albert Speer is an example. Although he was not a scientist, he was responsible for organizing the technicians, engineers and factories to maximize arms production. Under his command, science became an industrial tool. Laboratories operated as extensions of the battlefield. Even when the regime was already in decline, extreme projects continued to be funded. Hitler bet on miracle weapons, technological developments that, according to him, would change the fate of the conflict. No matter how unrealistic the idea was, if it sounded powerful, he financed it. That logic led to projects with no future, where resources were wasted on inventions that never worked. Sometimes they were rockets, other times experimental planes, sometimes electrical technologies impossible to apply. But the goal was to maintain the illusion that science would save the regime. In the final phases of the war, the relationship between Hitler and science became desperate. Each new project was seen as a lifeline. Each failed prototype as a betrayal. Many scientists were threatened, arrested, or executed if they did not achieve results. After the war, many of those same scientists justified themselves by saying they were just following orders. Others said they worked for science, not for the party. Some offered themselves to the Allies to avoid punishment, handing over their knowledge in exchange for protection. The truth is that science in the Third Reich was not free. It was controlled, used, and often distorted. Knowledge was applied not to improve lives, but to destroy them. And although there were real advancements, they almost always came accompanied by violence, repression, and death. Hitler never trusted the scientific community as such. He only valued those who followed orders without questioning. For him, a scientist was useful if he made weapons, produced poisons, or helped eliminate what he considered impure. Everything else was noise. The legacy of that era shows how science can be manipulated. It is not enough to have laboratories or theories. What matters is what is done with that knowledge, for whom one works, and to what ends human intelligence is directed. Under Nazism, that intelligence was hijacked by power. Peenemünde, the missile factory that fueled Nazi terror. In Berlin during the 1930s, talented young scientists found opportunities in government technical institutes. One of them was the PTR, a sort of German equivalent to the British National Physical Laboratory. There, in the optics department, began working a young man who had been helped by Lise Meitner, who connected him with Otto Hahn. Hahn, with his mocking style, used to play altered melodies as a joke and ask if that's how they really sounded. The new recruit was involved in atomic spectroscopy and in the creation of a new unit of measurement to replace candle power. He spent many hours testing ideas that almost never worked. Even so, he kept trying, because that's how one learned. Scientists shared space in the laboratory cafeteria, although he recalled that a group of women, nicknamed the Fever Girls, who handled calibration tasks, usually remained isolated. Although there was physical closeness, the atmosphere remained hierarchical. Around those years, another young scientist, Werner von Braun, was already standing out in the field of propulsion. He was ambitious, sociable, and knew how to navigate circles of power. He not only had technical knowledge, he also understood what the regime was looking for, weapons that could change the way war was waged. He did not hesitate to offer his ideas to the military, even if that meant working under the direct command of the army. Von Braun saw rockets as the path to the future, not only militarily, but also for exploration. But his immediate priority was to demonstrate that those missiles could be useful in the war that was being prepared. That's why he agreed to collaborate with the Army's program, which sought alternatives to the treaties that limited the use of heavy artillery after the First World War. In that context, the German Army developed a long-range missile project. The chosen site for testing was Kummersdorf, south of Berlin. There, a team led by Walter Dornberger began testing prototypes. Von Braun soon joined the group and contributed his expertise in aerodynamics and fuels. The first launches were rudimentary but promising. The military wanted concrete results. They were not interested in theories but in missiles that could fly long distances with precision. Von Braun, though still thinking of space, focused on giving them what they wanted. His team worked on the A1, A2 and then the A3, each more advanced than the last. The models had flaws, but each test provided valuable data. In 1936, the pressure increased. Germany was rearming its military, and high-ranking officials wanted to accelerate missile development. A larger, more remote and secure place was sought to continue the experiments. Thus, Peenemünde was born, a secret base on the Baltic Sea coast. The entire team moved there with better facilities, more resources and direct army control. Peenemünde became the heart of the German rocket program. It had laboratories, test tracks and technical personnel recruited from all over the country. Von Braun led the technical development, while Dornberger managed relations with military leadership. Both knew the project had top priority and that Hitler saw it as a strategic investment. The goal was clear: to create a rocket capable of carrying an explosive payload over 300 kilometers, surpassing any defense. That project was the A4, later known as the V2. The earlier V1 was an unmanned aircraft powered by a jet engine. The V2, by contrast, was a ballistic missile, the first of its kind. Its development combined knowledge of physics, engineering and mathematics. To manufacture these weapons on a large scale, a parallel industry was needed. Agreements were signed with companies like Siemens and Telefunken, which would supply components. Others, like IG Farben, would provide fuels and materials. The project demanded absolute precision. Any miscalculation could mean the loss of the rocket, or worse, a fatal accident. As the V2 neared its final phase, the war had already begun. Hitler showed direct interest in the weapon, believing it could change the course of the conflict. On a visit to Peenemünde, he was impressed by the prototypes. He gave his approval to increase the budget and accelerate production. From that point on, the project came under the supervision of the SS, with Himmler kept informed of every advancement. But problems also arose. The V2 required scarce materials, skilled personnel and technical conditions that were difficult to achieve in the middle of the war. Moreover, the tests continued to yield mixed results. Although some launches succeeded, others failed. Von Braun and his team knew that complete success was still far off. To keep the project going, forced labor was used. Prisoners of war and political detainees were transferred to underground factories where the V2 was produced under extreme conditions. Many died from exhaustion, accidents or punishment. Although this was organized by higher authorities, the technical team knew what was happening. Von Braun, when interrogated years later, said he had no power to change those decisions. But his presence at the facilities, his promotions within the military apparatus, and his key role in development showed that he was not just a bystander. He was aware and accepted the conditions in exchange for continuing with his project. In 1944, the V2 was launched against London. It reached its target, causing destruction and death. But it did not change the course of the war. Although technically it was an achievement, strategically it did not alter the balance. The missile arrived without warning, but with little precision. It could not change the military situation, only sow terror. Even so, Hitler maintained his faith in miracle weapons. He ordered continued production of the V2, even if it meant diverting resources from other areas. Propaganda presented it as an unprecedented breakthrough, proof of German ingenuity. But in practice, the weapon cost more than it achieved. At the end of the war, the Allies advanced into Germany and captured many of the production centers. Peenemünde was bombed. Von Braun and part of his team fled south. They knew that the Americans and Soviets were seeking to recruit scientists. Technical knowledge was now more valuable than ever. Von Braun surrendered to American forces. He was taken to the United States under Operation Paperclip, along with other members of his team. There, he worked for NASA and was a key figure in the development of the American space program. His Nazi past was minimized for convenience. The Uranium Club, Hitler's failed race for the atomic bomb. The science that led to the first nuclear weapons began as basic laboratory work, full of excitement and frantic pace. Some of the researchers had no idea where their work would take them. Others, in the midst of Hitler's regime, did see the risk from the start. What happened after the discovery of fission became a central episode in the success of the United States and the United Kingdom in building the first weapon of mass destruction, and in Germany's failure to achieve it. This story shows how scientists acted under pressure. They wanted to be first, avoided sharing achievements, and dodged responsibility. In the spring of 1933, while hundreds of scientists were being expelled from universities and institutes in Germany, Otto Hahn and Lise Meitner were working in Berlin at a laboratory of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. Meitner was Austrian and Jewish, although she had converted to Protestantism. Already at that time, she was struggling to keep her position. She was the only woman physicist in Germany at that level, but she could not publish without Hahn as co-author. Hahn, on the other hand, could sign on his own. In 1934, the team began bombarding uranium with neutrons to see what new elements formed. The goal was to create what were called transuranic elements, heavier than uranium. In Italy, Enrico Fermi was doing something similar and claimed to have found new elements. But what was actually happening was different. When uranium nuclei were hit, they split. No one knew it yet. Several years passed with confusing results. The data did not match expectations. In 1938, Meitner had to flee Germany after the annexation of Austria. She escaped through the Netherlands and arrived in Stockholm. From there, she remained in contact with Hahn. At the end of that year, Hahn and his colleague Fritz Strassmann sent a sample of bombarded uranium to a chemical laboratory. The result was unexpected. Barium had formed, a much lighter element. Something did not add up. Hahn wrote to Meitner, who, together with her nephew Otto Frisch, tried to understand what was happening. On a winter holiday, while walking through the forest in Sweden, Meitner and Frisch discussed the phenomenon. They concluded that the nucleus had split. They used the term fission, taken from biology, to explain the break. Frisch was the one who wrote it in a letter sent to Niels Bohr. Bohr, upon reading it, realized what it meant. He immediately left for the United States, where the discovery caused a major impact. It was understood that, if a nucleus split, it released an enormous amount of energy. If that reaction could be controlled, it would become a new source of energy. If it could be triggered in an uncontrolled way, it could create an explosion. In Berlin, physicists also quickly understood what this implied. The Nazi regime, at war or close to it, was seeking any advantage. That is why, in April of 1939, a secret group of scientists was formed to study fission. They called it the Uranium Club. Among them were Walter Gerlach, Kurt Diebner, Werner Heisenberg, and other well-known names. The group met for the first time on the 26th of April. Diebner from the Ministry of Armaments was the link between science and the government. Heisenberg and his colleagues knew that, if a chain reaction could be achieved, two paths would open, one to produce energy, the other to make weapons. In June, Heisenberg submitted a secret report explaining the principles of a nuclear bomb. He said that, if a critical mass of enriched uranium could be achieved, an explosion could be triggered. But there were enormous technical obstacles. First, separating the isotope uranium-235, the only one useful for a bomb, from the more common uranium-238. Second, sustaining the chain reaction. Third, producing that mass in sufficient quantity. Heisenberg wrote that this would take years and would require resources that Germany at war could hardly dedicate. Even so, the work continued. They tried to build a prototype reactor. Graphite was initially used as a moderator, but the first attempts failed. Later, they chose heavy water. Germany had access to a plant in Norway that produced it. That reinforced the regime's interest. In parallel, it was studied whether plutonium, an element not found in nature but formed inside a reactor, could be used as an explosive. That path, however, also required functional reactors. And the reactors did not work. Neutrons were absorbed by the materials used, and critical mass was not achieved. Meanwhile, in the United States, with support from the United Kingdom, the Manhattan Project was launched. They had thousands of workers, an almost unlimited budget, and coordination among universities, companies, and the military. In Germany, on the other hand, the Uranium Club failed to take off. There was no clear central leadership or prioritized support. The German army, at one point, decided that the project would not yield results in time. So it was moved from the Ministry of Armaments to the Reich Research Council. It went from being a military priority to just another research project. That marked the beginning of stagnation. The German scientists continued working, but without real pressure. They were not forced to deliver results. They had limited resources, but enough freedom to continue with their ideas. Some thought that if they managed to make a reactor, they could justify their work to the regime. In 1941, Heisenberg traveled to Copenhagen and met with Niels Bohr. It is unclear what he said. Some believe he wanted to warn him about the risks. Others think he was seeking to learn what the Allies were doing. The truth is that this meeting marked a key moment. Bohr was left uneasy. Later, he fled to the United States and joined the Manhattan Project. In Germany, the project continued with the ups and downs. In Leipzig, a reactor attempt ended in an explosion. In Berlin, another experiment failed to reach critical mass. Parts of the equipment were moved to rural areas to protect them from bombings, but the war was already going badly for Germany. The priority was to hold the front, not to build weapons that might work in years. As the Allies advanced, the scientists tried to hide their work. Many destroyed documents or buried them. Others saved them to hand over if captured. In April of 1945, American soldiers found an incomplete reactor in Haigerloch. It was poorly protected with no real results. There was no bomb, not even close. After the war, the German physicists were taken to a guarded house in England. There, unaware they were being recorded, they spoke among themselves. They were surprised to learn about Hiroshima. Some expressed relief that they had not been the first. Others regretted having failed. But they all agreed that, with more resources, they would have succeeded. Tanks, cannons and aircraft, the engineering of war. During the early years of the conflict, the German army demonstrated an effective combination of applied science, modern engineering, and precise military strategies. The result was the tactic known as blitzkrieg, which allowed rapid advances into enemy territory before defenses could be organized. This tactic relied on fast armored vehicles, coordinated attack aircraft, and real-time communication between mobile divisions. German tanks of that period were the product of continuous evolution that began after the First World War. Although the Treaty of Versailles prohibited their manufacture, German engineers secretly collaborated with foreign companies to continue developing them. When the Nazi Party came to power, the designs were ready for production. Models such as the Panzer III and Panzer IV were fundamental in the early campaigns, thanks to their maneuverability, firepower, and durability. As the war progressed, heavier versions like the Tiger and the Panther were introduced. These tanks stood out for their thick armor and their ability to destroy enemy targets at long range. However, they also required a lot of fuel, specific spare parts, and highly trained crews. Although feared for their power, they could not be produced in sufficient numbers to replace constant losses. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets deployed the T-34, which combined speed, sloped armor, and ease of production. The German response was to further reinforce their tanks, but that meant increasing their weight and complexity. Over time, this affected Germany's logistical capacity, as their heavy tanks needed reinforced bridges, special trailers, and more powerful engines. Artillery was also an essential part of the German advance. Field guns, howitzers, and anti-tank weapons were used on all front lines. One of the most iconic weapons was the 88mm cannon, originally designed as anti-aircraft but proven highly effective against enemy tanks. Its armor-piercing capability made it a key asset during the battles in the desert and in Russia. Beyond conventional weapons, the regime promoted the creation of more ambitious systems. The Gustav cannon, also known as Dora, was a gigantic weapon built by Krupp. It measured nearly 50 meters and fired 7-ton projectiles. It took weeks to assemble and operate. It could only be used under controlled conditions and required thousands of soldiers for transport and protection. It was used in the siege of Sevastopol, but its military impact was limited due to its slowness and vulnerability. Meanwhile, small arms were also evolving. The German army introduced the first modern automatic rifle, the Sturmgewehr 44. This weapon combined the power of a machine gun with the handling of a standard rifle. Its medium-range ammunition and rate of fire made it ideal for urban combat. Although it influenced later designs like the AK-47, its mass production came too late and did not change the course of the war. German engineers also worked on landmines, hand grenades, flamethrowers, and other portable equipment. Each new design was tested at the front and adjusted according to the results. However, the pace of the war exceeded the capacity for adaptation. Many inventions did not arrive in time or were too costly to manufacture on a large scale. In the air, the Luftwaffe deployed fighters and bombers with advanced technology. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was the main fighter in the early stages. Later came models like the Focke-Wulf 190, with better armament and maneuverability. Heavy bombers were also developed, though never with the same capacity as the Allies. Toward the end of the conflict, Germany introduced the first operational jet aircraft, the Messerschmitt Me 262. Its speed easily surpassed any Allied fighter, but it was fragile, required long runways, and its engines needed constant maintenance. Moreover, it arrived too late and in limited numbers. It did not change the Allied air superiority, already consolidated since 1944. The production of all these machines depended on an extensive industrial network. Companies like Krupp, Messerschmitt and Henschel handled the design and assembly. Thousands of forced laborers were employed in the factories under military supervision. Conditions were harsh, with long hours, poor nutrition and frequent punishment. Without this labor force, the war effort would have collapsed earlier. The regime also turned to science to improve materials. Lighter and stronger alloys, synthetic fuels and cooling systems were researched. Laboratories worked under tight deadlines and constant pressure. Some advances were implemented, others remained prototypes. The urgency and lack of resources limited real possibilities for innovation. In terms of communication, portable radios, encrypted systems, and direct links between mobile units were developed. This enabled more effective coordination during initial offensives. However, the Allies managed to break several of those codes, which gave them an advantage in key battles. The relationship between scientists, engineers, and the military was functional but not always harmonious. Technicians proposed ideas that generals rejected as impractical. Other times, commanders demanded impossible results within unrealistic deadlines. This tension increased as the war grew more desperate. From 1943 onward, with the loss of Stalingrad and the Allied advance in Africa, the pressure mounted. Hitler demanded new weapons that would bring an immediate turnaround. He ordered the acceleration of unfinished projects, regardless of the risks. This led to failures, accidents, and frustrations. In the final months of the conflict, propaganda presented these weapons as miraculous solutions. They spoke of rockets, supersonic cannons, invisible submarines. But in practice, they were more promises than realities. Science had been put at the service of a regime that did not understand its limits. Germany's initial advantage in technology gradually faded. The Allies, with more resources, better organization, and control of the air, surpassed those achievements. In addition, their production systems were more flexible. They could manufacture thousands of tanks, planes, and light weapons in record time. The result was clear. Although Germany produced impressive machines, it could not maintain them in sufficient quantity or protect them in the field. Enigma and B-Dienst, the hidden battle for Allied secrets. In the years leading up to the Second World War, German military intelligence not only developed physical weapons, but also focused on deciphering enemy communication systems. This activity was organized into different specialized branches, each oriented toward intercepting, translating, and decoding military and diplomatic messages. Although these operations were kept strictly secret, they played a central role in decisions made by the Nazi High Command. From the early years of the conflict, the Reich had at least 7 cryptographic offices, each reported to different structures, some to the army, others to the navy, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or even the Luftwaffe. Each operated separately, which caused duplication of efforts and internal competition, a common feature of Nazi organization. One of the most efficient branches was the Naval Intelligence Unit, known as B-Dienst. This agency had been collecting data on the Allies since the 1920s. As tensions increased in Europe, its activities intensified. When war broke out, B-Dienst was already intercepting British transmissions, especially those of the Royal Navy. Its work was centered in coastal stations such as Flensburg on the Baltic Sea and other strategic locations. This agency made significant advances before many of its counterparts, even partially understanding British maritime convoy codes. By 1940, B-Dienst was decoding Allied messages about supply routes in the Atlantic with little difficulty. This information allowed German submarines to act more precisely, ambushing and sinking ships carrying vital cargo for Great Britain, but not all services of the Reich were so effective. While B-Dienst had early successes, the overall Nazi cryptographic system suffered from fragmentation. Each division used different methods without centralized coordination. For example, the Luftwaffe developed its own decoding unit and rarely shared its findings. This lack of internal communication reduced the overall impact of the regime's cryptographic effort. Even within the army, multiple offices operated in parallel, trying to solve the same enemy codes without contacting one another. This disorganization was worsened by the regime's obsession with secrecy and mutual surveillance among departments. One of the key devices in this hidden war was the Enigma machine. Although better known for its use in transmitting German messages, the Nazis also tried to replicate its logic to break enemy codes. Enigma operated with a rotor system that changed the encoding of each letter with every keystroke. This created millions of possible combinations. The idea was that if one knew the machine model and the day's configuration, the message could be reversed. The problem for the Germans was that the British used their own versions of encryption, with systems that were different and harder to predict. Despite this, the Reich's cryptographers achieved some results. On the Eastern Front, they managed to intercept and understand several Soviet messages, at least during the early stages of the invasion. They also captured Russian devices that made the task easier. However, Soviet intelligence improved its protocols, and over time it became impossible to keep up. In addition, the Germans never managed to break the United States' diplomatic encryption systems, which meant they were always at a disadvantage against Washington. One of the most symbolic moments of this secret war occurred in 1941, when one of B. Dienst's stations, located in the Netherlands, managed to break the system called Naval Cipher No. 3, used by the British to coordinate their convoy routes. This breakthrough allowed German submarines to more accurately locate ships transporting food, ammunition, and reinforcements from America. For over a year, this tactical advantage translated into hundreds of sunken vessels. It was a significant blow to Allied logistics, but as with many other technological areas of the Third Reich, the advantage faded due to lack of strategic vision. Instead of centralizing these findings and adapting them to a unified military plan, the offices continued acting independently. While the Nazis were trying to break enemy codes, the British were doing the same at Bletchley Park. The British team, led by figures such as Alan Turing, eventually succeeded in breaking the naval version of the Enigma machine. This allowed them to anticipate key movements of the Kriegsmarine. The irony is that the Nazis never imagined their own encryption had been compromised. They maintained absolute confidence in the supposed inviolability of Enigma, which led them to not update their protocols as frequently as needed. This overconfidence made the Allies' work even easier. On land, the German army also deployed mobile interception units. These stations, mounted on trucks or transport vehicles, followed Allied troops, captured radio signals, and tried to decipher them on the move. Although some missions were successful, many others failed due to the speed with which the Allies changed their frequencies. Moreover, the increasing use of coded English among enemy units further reduced the effectiveness of these mobile operations. The lack of coordination was also evident in personnel training. Many operators and analysts were trained in a rushed manner, without a common plan or unified doctrine. Each branch of the army or government created its own courses, resulting in a mix of criteria and standards. In some cases, expert cryptographers were assigned to administrative tasks, while inexperienced personnel were sent to key stations. This misuse of human resources affected the quality of work at crucial moments. Another weakness was the underestimation of enemy technological advances. While the British developed techniques based on statistical analysis and early forms of automatic computing, the Germans continued relying on more traditional methods. Innovation in code-breaking processes lagged behind. Even with intercepted signals and competent personnel, technical delay limited their ability to respond. This contrasts with the Anglo-Saxon approach, where mathematicians and physicists were incorporated from the beginning into cryptographic operations. As the war progressed, errors accumulated. The office in charge of decoding messages from Allied bombers never managed to anticipate their attacks accurately. This left German cities exposed throughout the bombing campaign. The leaders of the Reich expected cryptographic analysis to offer immediate tactical advantages, but the reality was different. Without a central structure or sufficient investment, the system fell behind. The contrast with the British success at Bletchley Park was clear by the end of the conflict. Institutional fragmentation and overconfidence were the main causes of Germany's cryptographic failure. Despite having good interceptors, trained operators, and access to key messages at certain times, they never managed to transform that information into lasting operational superiority. Meanwhile, their own messages were being intercepted and read by the Allies without their knowledge. IG Farben, Chemical Science in the Service of Extermination. In late 1944, writer and chemist Primo Levi was taken as a prisoner to the Buna Monowitz camp, an extension of Auschwitz. From there, as part of a group of slave laborers, he was forced to work on the IG Farben plant being built nearby. This factory was part of one of the largest companies in the world, specialized in chemicals, pharmaceuticals, and synthetic fuels. What Levi witnessed at that facility was an industrial version of Nazi horror, where science was applied without ethics or limits. IG Farben was not a simple company. It was formed by the merger of several major German chemical industries, including Bayer, BASF, and Hoechst. Since the 1920s, it had developed key technologies for the production of dyes, medicines, pesticides, and fuels. During the Nazi regime, its ties to the government became increasingly close. They not only benefited from state contracts, but also participated directly in the planning of strategic projects. In Buna, IG Farben built a massive plant to produce synthetic rubber, known as Buna, and also artificial fuels. The company chose the location for its proximity to the railway and the availability of free labor, prisoners from the concentration camp. Thousands of people were forced to work in inhuman conditions, without pay, with minimal food, and under constant SS supervision. IG Farben's scientists knew that workers were dying from exhaustion, illness, or punishment. Nevertheless, the project continued. It was not the isolated decision of one executive, but an entire structure in which engineers, technicians, and laboratory heads actively collaborated with the apparatus of repression. The goal was to maintain production at any cost. Beyond forced labor, IG Farben supplied chemicals used in the camps. The most well-known was Zyklon B, a pesticide converted into lethal gas for the extermination chambers. Although it was originally produced by another company, Degesch IG Farben held shares and had direct knowledge of its final application. Several of its employees were involved in the distribution of the product to Auschwitz and other camps. After the war, Allied authorities identified 24 senior IG Farben officials as responsible for crimes. They were brought to trial in Nuremberg in a separate process, apart from the main trial against Nazi leaders. Among the accused were production directors, economists, engineers, and chemists. They all knew what was happening in the camps. Some had even visited the facilities. During the trial, internal meetings were documented in which the use of prisoners was openly discussed. Their cost, productivity, and the need to replace them with new detainees when they could no longer work were topics of planning. The minutes showed how prisoner requests were scheduled as if they were merchandise. There was no technical language hiding the brutality. The accused tried to defend themselves by saying they did not make political decisions. They claimed to be technicians, merely following orders, or that they didn't know the details of what happened in the camps. But the evidence proved otherwise. The company paid a fixed amount per slave worker to the SS, which implied a formal commercial relationship. Furthermore, several of the accused had signed contracts with full knowledge of the situation. One of the most well-known defendants was Fritz Termeer, responsible for IG Farben's industrial expansion plans. He participated in the construction of the Buna plant and had direct information about the working conditions. After the trial, he was sentenced to 7 years in prison. However, he was released before serving the full sentence, and later returned to hold important positions in the pharmaceutical industry. The IG Farben case marked a key moment in the history of scientific responsibility. It showed how a company based on research and innovation could become a direct collaborator in a criminal system. This was not science applied for military purposes, as in the case of bombs. It was science in service of extermination, labor abuse, and economic profit. Additionally, IG Farben participated in medical experiments conducted in the camps. Drugs, vaccines, and treatments were tested on prisoners without consent. The data was collected by doctors linked to the company and later used to adjust formulas or launch new products. In some cases, the effects were painful, irreversible, or lethal. Yet the reports were preserved and shared among departments. In Auschwitz, the company's chemists had their own laboratories. From there, they supervised product quality, conducted resistance tests, and evaluated the effects of certain compounds. They collaborated with the SS not only as suppliers but as technical partners. Science was not a neutral tool, it was part of the system of control and destruction. The industrial dimension of the Holocaust cannot be understood without the role of I.G. Farben. Its technology allowed the Nazis to sustain the war effort when natural resources were scarce. Its laboratories produced substitutes for rubber, gasoline, and other key inputs. But they also developed methods to manage camps, handle slave labor, and optimize the performance of detainees. After the war, the company was dismantled. Its assets were divided among former subsidiaries, which returned to the market under new names. Bayer, for example, resumed operations as an independent company. Many of its executives maintained ties to the previous era. Although some faced legal proceedings, most returned to work without restrictions. Wunderwaffen, the impossible projects of the end. Throughout 1942, as defeats began to accumulate, the Nazi regime started to speak of new weapons that would change the course of the war. These Wunderwaffen, or miracle weapons, were presented as the ultimate technical solution. From supersonic projectiles to self-guided missiles, the announcements aimed to maintain internal morale, intimidate the enemy, and justify the growing expenditures on secret projects. The idea that German science held a hidden power predated the war. Even during the 1930s, engineers and physicists of the Third Reich had been developing advanced technologies. But when the conflict intensified and pressure mounted, these investigations accelerated, with direct backing from Hitler, Himmler, and Albert Speer. Alongside the V2, the V1 was promoted, a flying bomb with a pulse engine that emitted a characteristic buzzing sound. The V1 had a shorter range and was easier to produce, but it was also imprecise. It often veered off course or fell short of its target. The Allies developed techniques to shoot it down in flight or sabotage its launch ramps. In addition to these missiles, other lesser-known projects were developed. One was the V3 cannon, designed to fire projectiles over great distances using a series of explosive charges placed along the barrel. The idea was to bombard London from France without using rockets. Facilities were built but never effectively used. They were destroyed by bombings before entering service. Another area of research was jet aviation. The Me-262 became one of the regime's most visible bets, presented as a symbol of German technical progress. Although it reached speeds greater than enemy fighters, delays, logistical problems, and poor tactical use prevented it from making a real difference in the conflict. Unconventional aircraft designs were also developed, such as the flying-wing Horton Ho 229, which had a futuristic silhouette. Some models were intended to operate with low radar detection. Although these prototypes showed technical creativity, they did not progress beyond the experimental stage before the conflict ended. In the naval domain, submarines with advanced technologies were developed. Type 21 featured quieter electric systems, the ability to stay submerged longer, and improved navigation. But only a few were used before the surrender. Mass production was affected by bombings, sabotage, and lack of resources. The effort to maintain these projects consumed vast amounts of money, materials, and personnel. Resources were diverted that could have been used for conventional weapons or the front lines. In addition, prisoners were used to build the facilities, as in Dora Mittelbau, causing thousands of deaths. The hand-dug tunnels under constant surveillance served as hidden factories, but the conditions were brutal. Nazi propaganda exaggerated the potential of these weapons. In newspapers, speeches, and internal bulletins, it was claimed that intercontinental missiles, energy rays, and bombs that would shake the Allies were about to be launched. But in reality, many of these ideas were sketches without sufficient technical backing. One proposal was the A9-A10 missile, a two-stage rocket that, in theory, could reach the United States. It was designed on paper but never progressed beyond models. Another project was a suborbital plane, which would launch with rockets and then glide at high altitude to drop its payload. It too remained in the early test phase. In some cases, the ideas bordered on fantasy. There was talk of seismic bombs, sound weapons, solar projectors from satellites, and even electromagnetic cannons. Although some of these proposals had a certain physical basis, there were no real means to develop them. Nevertheless, budgets were approved, and teams were assigned as if they were achievable within months. Part of the problem was desperation. As Germany lost ground, quick solutions were sought. Hitler believed that a single invention could reverse everything. He demanded immediate results, creating constant pressure on engineers. Some hid delays, others promised the impossible. The technical atmosphere became chaotic. Meanwhile, the Allies analyzed every trace of information. Intelligence missions searched for blueprints, prototypes, and scientists. They infiltrated factories, intercepted messages, and spied on facilities. The fear of a Nazi superweapon was real, though often exaggerated. This justified operations like Alsos, dedicated to securing technology before the Soviets. When the Allies entered Germany, they found several of these projects incomplete. In places like Nordhausen, they captured equipment and experimental models. Technical documents were also seized and later used in their own military and space programs. The most prominent German scientists were detained or recruited. Their experience with rockets became the foundation for the American space program. In the Soviet Union, a similar process took place. Technicians and materials were relocated to strengthen their military program. Despite all the investment, the miracle weapons did not change the outcome of the war. They arrived late, in small numbers, and with technical flaws. The true power of the Allies was their industrial capacity, air superiority, and logistical control. Nazi science showed ingenuity, but it was poorly directed and poorly used. Operation Alsos and Paperclip, the technological spoils after the fall of the Reich. As the war in Europe neared its end, the Allied powers accelerated a quiet operation to capture all of Nazi Germany's technology, laboratories, and technical personnel before they fell into Soviet hands. The United States, the United Kingdom, and the USSR understood that the true wealth of the Third Reich was not only in factories and weapons, but also in mines, patents, and archives. In April of 1945, the US Army launched Operation Alsos. Its mission was to locate, secure, and transfer nuclear materials, laboratories, scientists, and technical documents. Part of the team consisted of scientific officers. They moved behind the front, entering captured cities, interrogating researchers, and emptying buildings before other commands arrived. They were not only looking for the atomic project, they wanted anything with military or industrial value. Simultaneously, the United Kingdom organized similar operations. They had lists of researchers, blueprints, universities, and companies. Every region that came under British control was inspected by technicians. Some German scientists, seeing the collapse of the regime, preferred to surrender to the British or Americans rather than be captured by the Soviets. They knew they could negotiate their freedom in exchange for knowledge. The USSR also organized its own operation. When the Red Army took Berlin, special units were sent to search for technology and scientists. They identified industrial facilities, research centers, and took everything from machinery to entire personnel groups. The goal was to replicate the German model on Soviet soil. Factories were dismantled, and trains loaded with equipment were sent east. The United States initiated Operation Paperclip. Although it was originally created to assess enemy scientists, it quickly became a recruitment network. Researchers who had worked for the Nazi regime were evaluated, classified, and, if deemed useful, discreetly transferred to North America. Their ties to the SS or to experiments in concentration camps were erased. What mattered was what they knew, not what they had done. One of the most well-known names was Werner von Braun. He had worked at Peenemünde, led the development of the V-2 rocket, and was a member of the SS. Nevertheless, he was taken to the United States with his team, received protection, and began collaborating with the US military. Years later, he became a key figure in the American space program. Doctors, chemists, aeronautical engineers, and rocket experts were also brought over. Some began working for the Air Force, others for private laboratories. In many cases, their files were modified. Intelligence agencies justified these actions by saying it was necessary to stay ahead of the Soviets. The United Kingdom adopted a similar strategy. German scientists were sent to work in British research centres. Confidential agreements were signed. Some collaborated for months, others were interrogated and returned. The priority was to extract as much information as possible on fuels, radars, rockets, submarines, and synthetic materials. In the Soviet zone, German scientists were treated with less subtlety. Some were detained and sent to special centres in Moscow. There, they worked under surveillance. They were offered basic conditions, but were not allowed to leave or contact their families. In other cases, they were assigned to military projects. The USSR copied many German technologies through these contacts. The looting was not limited to people. Libraries, laboratories, technical museums, and industrial archives were emptied. In every occupied building, intelligence teams collected blueprints, formulas, samples, and prototypes. Everything was packed, classified, and sent by plane or ship. German universities lost entire collections. Companies such as Siemens, IG Farben and Krupp were partially dismantled to extract their technical knowledge. The documents found revealed the scale of the Nazi scientific apparatus. There were studies on drugs, chemical weapons, synthetic fuels, radio communication techniques, long-range rockets, supersonic aircraft, self-guided torpedoes, and more. Many of these investigations were in advanced stages. Although they had not changed the course of the war, they represented a technical advantage. In the United States, these materials were distributed among military agencies, universities, and private companies. The goal was to exploit every discovery for future use. Some patents were registered under the names of American corporations. The same occurred in the United Kingdom. In the USSR, the findings were integrated into their 5-year plans and arms race. Access to this information boosted technological development in the West. In the following years, the Allied countries incorporated German advances in aviation, medicine, electronics, optics, and metallurgy. A cumulative effect was created. What Germany had been unable to implement due to lack of time or resources now passed into the hands of its former enemies. Not all German scientists were welcomed. Some were rejected for their backgrounds, others died before they could contribute, but many did manage to integrate into the new systems. They became advisors, professors, or laboratory heads. Their past was forgotten or ignored. What mattered was their usefulness. In Germany, the subject was silenced for years. The files on Paperclip were not open to the public until the late 20th century. Meanwhile, later generations grew up unaware that many modern advances had been built on the work of former members of the Nazi regime. The ethical debate over that legacy continues to this day. During the Third Reich, science was shaped to serve power. Knowledge was not pursued for its intrinsic value, but for its immediate utility. Every project, every formula, every experiment was evaluated by what it could contribute to the military, to social control, or to the extermination apparatus. The regime used laboratories as weapons factories, universities as ideological filters, and scientists as replaceable parts. What failed to produce practical results was discarded. What worked was exploited, regardless of ethical consequences. Medical research became an instrument of violence. Engineering was used to build systems of destruction. Chemistry, physics, and mathematics were placed in the service of a state that did not seek progress, but obedience. When the regime collapsed, the Allies rushed to seize what remained. They captured documents, technology, experts, and prototypes. Part of the accumulated knowledge continued to circulate, now under new flags. Many of the names who had served the Reich reappeared in laboratories of the victorious powers. The scientific legacy of Nazism was not an advancement, it was a warning. It showed what happens when thought submits to power, when science stops questioning and starts obeying. What could have been used to build was used to destroy, and its traces, decades later, remain in archives, in patents, and in the silences that have yet to be broken.